90 kilometers of Queensland coastline hold two mysteries that have almost nothing in common, except the ground they share. On one side, a rainforest carries plant lineages that trace back further than most of the continents around it have existed in their current shape. On the other, a mountain made of black granite has a documented history of people walking in and never walking out. This is the Daintree. And before we explain either mystery, we need to say the name of the second one out loud, because we're going to leave it alone for a while. Kalkajaka, Black Mountain. Hold on to that. What makes this stretch of far north Queensland worth 40 minutes of your attention isn't that it is old. Plenty of places are old. It is that almost everything here can be verified. The plants have fossil records. The granite has a measurable age. The forest survival through multiple ice ages has been mapped refuge by refuge. And yet, at the edge of all that hard evidence, there is a mountain where the paper trail runs out, and the questions simply stop getting answered. If you want documentaries that separate genuine unexplained mystery from the kind that is just good marketing, this channel exists for exactly that reason. So if that is your kind of curiosity, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. We're going to start with the least visible mystery and the most important one, a group of flowers that shouldn't, by any reasonable timeline, still exist. In 1970, cattle on a property near the Daintree lowlands kept dying, and nobody could figure out why. The culprit turned out to be a seed pod from a plant nobody had properly identified. Scientists eventually named it Idiospermum australiensis. Locals just started calling it the green dinosaur. That nickname isn't poetic exaggeration. Idiospermum is one of the most primitive flowering plants alive today, with a fossil record stretching back over 100 million years. Its discovery is considered one of the most significant botanical finds in Australian history, not because it was rare, though it is, but because of what it represents, somewhere in the deep evolutionary past. Before most of what we'd recognize as a modern flower existed, something like this was already growing. It isn't alone. A short walk through the Daintree brings you past Ostrobalia scandens, a climbing vine that belongs to one of the oldest surviving lineages of flowering plants on the planet. Overhead, conifers like agathis and araucaria stand as living matches to fossils from the age of dinosaurs. Not distant relatives, but close counterparts to trees that grew alongside them. Cycads such as Bonia and Lepidosomia, plants that predate flowers altogether, still grow at ground level, largely unchanged. Here is the number that puts it all in perspective. Botanists recognize 19 primitive flowering plant families worldwide. 12 of them are found in this one stretch of Australian coastline, the highest concentration on Earth, in a rainforest that covers a fraction of a percent of the country's landmass. None of this means the Daintree is a single ancient forest that has stood untouched since the Jurassic. Individual trees live and die like anywhere else. What survives is the lineage, the genetic thread connecting what is rooted here now to species that grew on a very different planet. Understanding why that lineage survived means looking past the plants entirely down into the rock they're growing on. Long before Idiospermum's ancestors existed, this landscape was already taking shape, just not on the surface. Around 250 million years ago, during the Permian period, granite was forming deep underground along what would become Australia's east coast. That is roughly 70 million years before the plant lineages covered a moment ago first appear in the fossil record. For most of that time, the granite stayed buried sealed beneath layers of softer, metamorphic rock. What changed things was erosion. Slow, relentless, and unglamorous. Over hundreds of millions of years, wind and water wore away the rock sitting on top of the granite, gradually exposing what was underneath. The result is the landscape you see today. Thornton Peak rising over 1,300 meters above the canopy. Mount Pieta Bot's granite outcrops overlooking Cape Tribulation. The whole coastal range built from stone that spent most of its existence hidden. This matters for more than scenery. The mountains created by that erosion did something the plants alone never could. They built cooler, wetter pockets at altitude, sheltered from the drier climate spreading across the rest of the continent. That geology didn't just shape the view, it shaped where life could survive when almost everything around it started to change. Australia's climate hasn't always cooperated with its rainforests. Over the past several 100,000 years, the continent moved through repeated ice ages, and each time conditions turned drier across most of the eastern coast. Rainforests that once stretched much further inland and shrank, retreated, and in many places disappeared entirely, but not everywhere. Researchers studying the wet tropics have identified 3 specific pockets where forest conditions stayed stable through the last glacial maximum, even as the land around them dried out, one in the north, one central, one further south. Everywhere in between, the forest thinned or vanished. Inside those 3 pockets, it didn't. For the species trapped there was nowhere left to go. Surrounded by increasingly dry landscape with no climate corridor to escape through, they adapted in place instead. Over thousands of years of enforced isolation, many of them became something found nowhere else on the planet. The Daintree River ringtail possum is one result. A species now restricted almost entirely to Thornton Peak and the upper reaches of the Daintree and Mossman rivers. Nowhere else. The pattern of unusual, tightly localized species you find across the wet tropics today still traces back to the shape of those 3 ancient refuges. It is a remarkable survival story. It is also, uncomfortably, a preview. The same isolation that let these species specialize also means they have nowhere left to retreat to if conditions change again. Researchers modeling even a single degree of warming project that several frog, mammal, and skink species here could lose more than half their remaining habitat. The mountains that once saved them by giving them somewhere to hide now have a ceiling. So the question worth sitting with is simple. When the climate shifted last time, these species found an island of stable forest to retreat into. This time, is there another one waiting? Or was Thornton Peak the last stop? Walk far enough into the lowland Daintree, and you may eventually hear something before you see it. A low, rumbling call from somewhere in the undergrowth. If you are fortunate, what steps out is a bird standing close to 2 meters tall, with a bristling black body, a bright blue neck, and a horn, like casque on its head, that makes it look like it wandered in from an earlier geological era. In a sense, it did. The southern cassowary looks prehistoric because its lineage is old, but its importance to the Daintree has nothing to do with appearance. It comes down to fruit. Cassowaries eat the fallen fruit of at least 238 plant species, swallowing seeds whole and carrying them, undamaged, through their digestive systems before depositing them, often more than a kilometer from the parent tree, in piles of ready-made fertilizer. That single behavior makes the cassowary something close to irreplaceable. More than 70 tree species in this rainforest produce fruit too large for any other animal here to swallow and carry. No other bird, mammal, or reptile in the Daintree can do what the cassowary does for them. Some of those seeds even germinate better after passing through the bird's digestive tract, their tough outer coating softened along the way. Which means a striking number of the ancient plant lineages covered earlier in this documentary. Species whose ancestry stretches back tens of millions of years depend right now on a single endangered bird for their next generation. Current estimates put the wild population at somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 adult cassowaries. It is a strange kind of fragility. A forest old enough to have outlasted ice ages, resting part of its future on an animal that could disappear within a human lifetime. Everything covered so far has measured this landscape in millions of years. It is worth pausing on a much shorter number because it is still extraordinary. 50,000, that is roughly how long the Eastern Kuku Yalanji people have lived in this region. A span that reaches back to the earliest known human occupation of the Australian continent. Their traditional country stretches from around Mossman North to Cooktown, taking in the rainforest, the coastline, and the reef beyond it. It represents one of the longest continuous relationships between a human culture and a single landscape documented anywhere on Earth. Tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about which plants are food, which are poison, when to gather, when to move, and how to live inside a forest without exhausting it. European contact came comparatively recently and abruptly. The Daintree River wasn't mapped by colonial surveyors until 1873, when explorer George Elphinstone Dalrymple led the first European expedition into the valley and named the river after the geologist Richard Daintree. Gold, tin, and the promise of valuable red cedar timber followed quickly, drawing settlers into a region that had never needed them. By the 1930s, some Kuku Yalanji people had been forcibly relocated to church missions at Daintree and Mossman, a disruption to 50,000 years of continuity that arrived within the space of a few decades. That 50,000-year relationship with the land didn't end there. It came under direct threat one more time, less than a century later, and this time it was the forest itself that nearly didn't survive the fight. By 1983, the only reason a stretch of coastline between Cape Tribulation and Bloomfield remained undeveloped wasn't protection. It was inconvenience. There was no bridge across the Daintree River, just a barge, and the track beyond it was rough dirt at best. That was about to change. Douglas Shire Council, backed by state funding, began construction on a road connecting the two, cutting straight through the recently declared Cape Tribulation National Park. A small group of local residents showed up to stop it. What started as a handful of protesters quickly became a national story. Activists buried themselves in the bulldozers' path, some chained to concrete slabs and logs. Others climbed into the canopy and refused to come down, holding out for weeks against arrests, fines, and police dogs. It became known as the Daintree Blockade, and alongside the Franklin River protests 2 years earlier, it helped define the modern Australian environmental movement. The road was built anyway. Bulldozers pushed through in 3 weeks, and the Bloomfield track officially opened in October 1984. Appropriately, the opening ceremony's motorcade got bogged in mud within minutes of a downpour. But the blockade's real impact showed up afterward. The public pressure it generated helped end further logging on state land and built the case for the region's protection. In 1988, the wet tropics of Queensland, including the Daintree, was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The most significant shift, though, came decades later. In September 2021, more than 160,000 hectares, including the Daintree, Nagalba, Bulel, Hope Islands, and Kalkajaka National Parks, were formally handed back to the Eastern Kuku Yalanji people, placing the land under joint management with the Queensland government for the first time in the wet tropics history. It made the Daintree, the first wet tropics property, return to the people whose relationship with it predates every other chapter of this documentary. That victory arrives alongside an uncomfortable footnote. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature currently lists the wet tropics as a World Heritage Area of significant concern. One of only 3 such Australian sites, largely because of the climate pressures already described. The Daintree survived bulldozers. What it is up against now doesn't have a blockade line anyone can stand behind, which brings us back to the name we set aside at the very beginning, Kalkajaka, in English. It means roughly place of the spear. Most people know it as Black Mountain, and it sits within the same stretch of land handed back to the Eastern Kuku Yalanji people in 2021. The same land, the same custodians, and yet a completely different kind of unresolved. From a distance, it looks almost unnatural, a mass of jet black granite boulders, some the size of houses piled against each other with no soil visible anywhere between them. Up close, that absence of soil turns out to be the point. The gaps between the boulders form a labyrinth of chasms, crevices, and hidden drops, some large enough to walk into and never find your way back out of. The first documented disappearance dates to 1877, when a settler went looking for an escaped calf and simply never returned. Searchers found no trace of the man. The calf, or the horse he'd been riding, it wasn't an isolated case. In 1882, 2 farmers went into the boulder field hunting for missing cattle and vanished the same way. Later, a bushranger known as Sugarfoot Jack reportedly used the mountain as a hideout on the assumption that few people would follow him in. Over the following century, stories accumulated of people, horses, and entire herds of cattle disappearing into the rocks without explanation. The most credible scientific explanation is straightforward, if unsettling, falls. Wander into that boulder field, and it is possible to drop into a hidden chasm with no way to climb back out, disoriented, out of water, with no clear path toward help. It is the kind of terrain where getting lost isn't a metaphor, it is a mechanism. But here is where the honesty of this story matters more than the drama of it. Some historians who've gone looking for hard documentation of these cases have come up short. Many of the oldest reports exist only as retellings, without inquest records or contemporary police accounts to confirm them. That doesn't mean nothing happened here. It means we can't say with real confidence exactly how much did. So the mountain isn't Australia's Bermuda Triangle. It is something more interesting than that. A place where the explanation is almost certainly geological, and where the historical record is too thin to close the case completely. 2 different kinds of uncertainty sitting inside one landscape. So, is any of it actually unexplained? Mostly, no. The Daintree's plant lineages, its granite peaks, its Ice Age refuges, even its keystone bird, holding the whole system together, all of that has been measured, dated, and verified. What looks like mystery is, for the most part, just science that hasn't reached most people yet. Kalkajaka is the one genuine exception. The terrain explanation holds up. The historical record doesn't quite. What connects all of it, in the end, isn't mystery at all. It is survival against odds that should have ended things long before now. A plant lineage that outlasted the breakup of Gondwana. A handful of forest pockets that held on through ice ages that erased rainforest everywhere else on the continent. A culture that has maintained an unbroken relationship with this land for 50,000 years. Interrupted but never severed. A protest movement that stopped bulldozers with nothing but their own bodies. None of that required embellishment to be remarkable. The long-term picture is less settled. The same isolation that let this ecosystem become so distinctive now leaves it with nowhere to retreat as temperatures rise. And the international body that tracks World Heritage Sites has already flagged that concern. Whether the next chapter of the Daintree's survival story gets written the way the last several did isn't something anyone can promise yet. If you want to keep finding places where the real evidence is stranger than the folklore, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. There are other mountains, like Kalkajaka, scattered across Australia's far north, granite, black, largely unexplained, and we haven't gotten to any of them yet. For now, the Daintree keeps standing on the same ground it has held for a very long time, older than the question of whether it still can.